In a life that looked flawless, the truth was waiting to be exposed. She trusted him with everything, her heart, her future, her dreams. But while she was building a life full of hope, he was hiding secrets that could destroy it all. One moment, one discovery, and everything comes crashing down. The love she believed in turns into betrayal. The future she imagined disappears. But this is not where her story ends. Because in the middle of the chaos, she finds her strength. And what was meant to break her becomes the fire that makes her rise, stronger, fearless, and impossible to defeat. The lesson? Sometimes the truth is painful, but it's also the key to your freedom. Trust your instincts, know your worth, and never be afraid to walk away from what no longer serves you. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and support the channel. Your support is the biggest motivation for us to keep creating more meaningful stories like this. Thanks for watching.
With Chicago's architectural and real estate elite looking on, he twisted his fingers around her upper arm, his grip like steel cable. He dragged her through a gallery filled with modern photography and minimalist sculptures, a space whose nightly rental could have paid for their first apartment, and slammed her against a monolithic bronze installation. Her shoulder blade hit the metal with a dull, brutal thud. White light flared in her vision. His mother stood just feet away, the barest hint of a satisfied smile on her face. His lead designer, Isabella, let out a soft, contemptuous laugh before turning away, the staccato clicks of her heels on the polished concrete floor echoing with finality. Among the 200 developers and city planners in the room, not a single person flinched. She sagged against the sculpture, the world spinning sickeningly, while her husband, the man who swore to protect her, to build a future for their unborn child, leaned close and whispered the poison he had been perfecting for 6 years. "You are the draft I had to sketch to get to the masterpiece. You are a nobody. You came from a Rust Belt town with more boarded-up factories than opportunities, and you will go back there with less than you started with." But in that exact moment, a haunting, dynamic image began to resolve on the gallery's main projection wall, a piece of digital art commissioned for his firm's launch party. The artwork made the city's most formidable art critic stop his conversation mid-sentence. The older man, Marcus Thorne, tilted his head, his focus absolute. A look of pure, unadulterated shock spread across his features because that artwork held a secret, an artist's unmistakable signature style he had been hunting for the better part of a decade. A signature that was about to bring the architectural dynasty her husband had built on her silent sacrifice to its knees, the one his mother so ruthlessly defended, and the one his mistress was ready to claim. The woman he had just assaulted in the middle of the $600 million Astor Gallery was the anonymous street artist the entire art world was desperate to unmask. She was the genius, and she had nearly let him convince her she was worthless. This story is a brutal reminder of a truth we often choose to forget. Your value is not defined by the cruelty of others when you are at your lowest. It is forged in the solitary hours you spend creating, when you pour your entire being into your work while no one is watching. And frequently, the person who seems the most fragile holds the power to shatter an entire empire. If this story ignited a fire in you for justice, if you felt that sharp pang of betrayal, then you need to smash that subscribe button right now and enable all notifications. You are not going to want to miss this demolition. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in Chloe's shoes. Share this with anyone who needs to remember that their talent is theirs and theirs alone. And if you're still with me, thank you. You are why these stories must be told. The event's live stream cameras documented everything with cold objectivity. A pregnant woman in a plain blue dress stumbling against a bronze sculpture. A man's arm recoiling from the force of the shove. 200 guests in tailored, expensive suits captured in a tableau of calculated indifference. And then that awful, silent struggle for air. The collision with the sculpture sent a jolt of fire through Chloe Vance's spine, and her shoulder exploded with a pain so intense that black spots danced in her vision. A single bead of blood appeared on her lip, a shocking crimson against her ashen skin. For a terrifying beat, The only sound in the cavernous, stark white hall was the ragged edge of her own breathing. The digital art, her art, a piece she had created about the feeling of being invisible, morphed and flowed on the wall above, enveloping her like a burial shroud. The ambient sounds of the installation echoed off the soaring ceilings and drifted through the crowd of stone-faced guests. Not one of them moved toward her. 200 of Chicago's most powerful players in finance and design watched a pregnant woman fight to stay on her feet, and not a single one offered a hand. In a room like this, influence was the only thing that mattered, and from all outward appearances, Chloe was bankrupt. Her husband, Liam, loomed over her, his chest heaving, his classically handsome face contorted into a mask of utter disgust. His mother, Eleanor, stood by his side, lifting her champagne flute in a silent toast to his brutal display of power. And Isabella, the lead designer for Liam's firm and the other woman in their marriage, turned her back with a low, victorious hum. But what none of them noticed was the legendary critic, Marcus Thorne, striding with purpose toward the installation. None of them saw his eyes lock onto Chloe, his expression shifting from bewilderment to absolute, earth-shattering certainty. And none of them heard him say into his phone, his voice vibrating with the thrill of the greatest find of his career, "Draft the exclusive contract, the one we keep for the generational talents. I've found her. I'm looking right at her." Just 3 days earlier, Chloe had been a different woman. Not unrecognizable, just faded. She was a person who had been systematically erased over 6 years of marriage until her own voice was little more than a whisper in her own head. She woke at 6 a.m. on a Wednesday in a cold, minimalist penthouse she despised, in a bed where the other side was flawlessly made because Liam hadn't come home. Again. The high-thread count sheets were cold and empty. She had moved past disappointment. Disappointment requires a flicker of hope, and Chloe had learned years ago that hoping for anything from Liam Vance was a losing game. She brewed the coffee anyway, 2 mugs, 1 half decaf for her, 1 dark roast imported from Ethiopia for him. She prepared 2 bowls of Greek yogurt, arranging berries on one with the artisanal honey he preferred. 1 mug and 1 bowl would sit on the marble countertop untouched, as they did most mornings. Later, she would give the food to the building's doorman, a small gesture of kindness to offset the gnawing feeling of her own irrelevance. The penthouse was sprawling and antiseptic, designed in the stark, modern style Liam championed. Chloe kept it pristine because Eleanor, his mother, would often appear without warning, running a gloved finger over surfaces, hunting for a flaw with the predatory focus of an eagle. The only sign of Chloe was a small work table in a spare room, piled with sketchbooks and spray paint cans, a gift from her father, a thoughtful house painter. His face, grinning from a faded photograph, was the only true warmth in the entire residence. Chloe would trace the edge of the frame whenever she passed it. It had become a daily ritual since her father's passing 2 years before, which had taken both his calming presence and his steadfast belief in her gift. She took the L train to a shared artists co-op in the West Loop because her old hatchback had finally failed. The transmission gave out last week, a quiet, unceremonious death. She couldn't get a new one because Liam had liquidated their joint savings 3 months ago, claiming it was critical capital for his new high-rise project. She had learned not to ask to see the statements. In the dusty, paint-splattered studio, Chloe was someone else. She was Nyx, the anonymous muralist whose work was becoming a cult phenomenon on art forums. Here, she wasn't Liam's quiet, unimpressive wife. She was an artist. The few other creators who rented space there called her the Shadow because she came in before dawn and left long after dark, leaving only the scent of aerosol and genius behind. They honored her anonymity, and she clung to their respect, a currency that had long since been devalued at home. Her old art professor, Mr. Davies, who managed the co-op, caught her that morning, his kind eyes crinkling. "Chloe, I got a call that nearly made me drop my teeth. A senior curator from the Thorn Gallery. He's searching for nicks. He said the work is the most vital street art he's seen in 20 years. He wants to offer a major solo exhibition, no questions asked." Chloe felt a dizzying rush of hope, a sensation so unfamiliar it was almost painful. "Thank you, Mr. Davies. That's unbelievable." She spent the morning sketching, fueled by that single fragile ember of validation. During her break, she was slumped in a paint-stained armchair, gazing at the black mirror of her phone. No messages from Liam, not one, just the faint outline of a woman with weary eyes and a talent she had hidden from the world. Her best friend Maya, a corporate lawyer with a take-no-prisoners attitude, shouldered the studio door open, juggling 2 deep-dish pizza boxes and wearing a look that said she was ready for a hostile takeover. "Don't you dare tell me you're hiding out in this glorified closet, staring at a blank screen, hoping that Mr. Architect of the Future will suddenly remember he has a pregnant wife," Maya said, dropping the food onto a table. "Because my life coach just gave me a fantastic lecture on depreciating assets, and you, my dear, are about to get the condensed version." "Maya, I'm fine." "You are not fine. You're living on protein bars because your husband took your inheritance and sank it into his paradigm-shifting urban landscape. And my air quotes are now so aggressive, I think I've pulled a muscle. Let me be perfectly clear. When a man shows you he's a liability, write him off on the first quarterly report. You keep waiting for him to remodel his personality when the guy's entire foundation is cracked. He's a teardown, not a fixer-upper." Chloe surprised herself with a real laugh, a sound that felt foreign and unused. Maya always had that effect. She was a force of nature to Chloe's persistent quiet, a friend who served up harsh realities with enough sarcasm to make them palatable. Maya slid a box toward her. "Eat, and then tell me this. What is the first rule of intelligent investing? You're investing every fragment of your vision into this startup with 0 equity for yourself. For 6 years, you've been the sweat equity, the unpaid strategist, waiting for Marcus to magically grow a conscience. He is my husband, Chloe. A husband who missed your birthday dinner last month. A husband who calls your complex user experience wireframes cute little drawings. A husband whose mother still comes over to organize your office when you're not home." Chloe leaned forward, her voice a low, urgent hum. "You are carrying his child. You deserve to be a named co-founder in this, Clara, not the casualty of a hostile takeover." "You know I'm right." Clara's hand went instinctively to the swell of her stomach. "I know," she breathed, but the chasm between knowing and acting felt a mile wide. Chloe studied her, her face a mask of concern. Then she said the words that would echo in Clara's mind just days later as her life began to splinter. "There's a razor-thin line between being a supportive spouse and being the ghost developer of your own husband's success, babe. And I'm terrified you can't see it anymore." Clara was scrolling through her feed that Wednesday afternoon when an ad stopped her cold. It was a slick, targeted campaign for a new mental wellness app called Elysian. Marcus was in the ad, looking charismatic and visionary, standing next to the infamous venture capitalist Isabel Sterling. They were announcing a beta launch, and the fluid, intuitive user interface gliding across the screen was a phantom limb. A part of her own mind she was seeing for the first time outside of her own laptop. Clara felt the clean, sharp click of a final decision locking into place in her chest. Isabel Sterling had a way of occupying a space. Her influence was so potent it felt like a shift in the air pressure. She wore her reputation as a Silicon Valley kingmaker like a second skin, and her laugh was a perfectly engineered sound, ready for a podcast feature. Marcus introduced her as the brilliant mind who was bankrolling his app into a global phenomenon, But the way her gaze swept over their San Francisco condo, lingering on the custom whiteboard wall covered in Clara's design sprints, told the whole story. It was the clinical appraisal of someone deciding what to keep after an acquisition. "So, this is the command center," Isabel remarked, her voice as polished and cool as brushed steel. "The view is an asset. The workflow, however, seems a bit analog. I was just telling Marcus on the ride over, our launch needs a narrative that feels inevitable, like it simply willed itself into existence. You have to build the mythology before you write the first line of public code, you see?" Clara rested a hand on the curve of her belly, a small, subconscious act of self-preservation. She was beginning to feel like an intruder in her own home, as if her very presence, her pregnancy, was an inconvenient detail in Marcus's origin story. She offered a quiet hello that was absorbed by the room's energy and retreated to the kitchen. And that was when she saw it. Mirrored from Isabel's tablet to their 65-inch television was the interactive prototype of the app. It was the centerpiece of their pitch deck. For their new chapter, for their baby. A profoundly personal, proprietary software architecture based on cognitive behavioral therapy she had designed for them. A platform she had poured thousands of hours into, where every line of code was a silent promise from Marcus that this was their shared creation. The original project folder was gone, replaced by the sterile corporate branding, Project Elysian, but the design was hers. Every user pathway, every micro-interaction. It was the soul of her work, lifted wholesale from her secure personal server. Just last week, Marcus had told her she was getting lost in the weeds, that she needed to think more about baby strollers and less about her side projects. And now it was being pitched by another woman to his new partners in her own living room. "That's my UI." Clara's voice was a mere whisper, but in the focused silence of the pitch, it was a bomb. Isabel glanced over, her expression a perfect mask of polite curiosity, like an actress whose scene partner had gone off script. "I'm sorry? On the screen, that entire user flow. I designed that for us." The atmosphere in the room turned thick and cold. Marcus's easy, charming smile tightened into something thin and brittle. Isabel, the consummate professional, was a study in calm. She simply gestured to the screen. Marcus spoke first, his tone dropping to that dangerously quiet level Clara knew was the prelude to a hurricane. "Clara, let's not make this dramatic. Convergent evolution happens in tech all the time. Isabel and I have been iterating on this for months. Do you honestly think that because you doodled some similar mock-ups, you have a claim? This is your problem, Clara. You get too emotional. You treat business concepts like they're your children." Isabel finally set down her tablet, leaning against the counter with the easy posture of someone who had already closed the deal. "She has a creator's heart, Marcus. It's all passion. It's sweet, honestly, but it doesn't scale." Isabel then smiled, a slow, deliberate smile aimed directly at Clara. "I think what Marcus is trying to say is that a truly disruptive idea will always find its way to the people with the resources to execute it." She lifted her glass of sparkling water, a gesture of effortless victory. "It's a brilliant interface. Marcus has a real talent for spotting potential, at the very least." The quiet murmur of agreement from the other partners was the sound of a digital vault being locked, with Clara's life's work trapped inside. And the most sickening part was the small, defeated voice in her head whispering that maybe they were right. She excused herself, murmuring something about feeling dizzy, and closed the bedroom door without a sound, because even her heartbreak wasn't allowed to disrupt the pitch. She leaned her forehead against the cool glass of the window, her hands trembling, and dialed her brother, Ethan. She was presenting my entire app framework, Ethan, to her new VC partners on our smart TV, and he just stood there and told me I was being emotional. Ethan was silent for exactly 2 seconds, which for him was an eternity. Then he said, "Clara, The audacity of those two could power every server farm in Silicon Valley. You see what this is, right? This isn't him just being a jerk. This is intellectual property theft. I just need to survive tonight, Ethan. That's all I can think about. No, Clara, Ethan's voice sliced through her despair, sharp and clear. There is a world of difference between surviving this and winning. Surviving is letting them get away with it. Winning is when you document their theft so thoroughly that you can dismantle their entire launch. And I need you to start saving everything. Now, Clara ended the call, sinking onto the edge of the bed, the muffled sound of their celebratory toasts seeping under the door. She twisted the simple silver ring her mother had left her, wondering if she had the strength to walk out of that condo and burn his whole world to the ground. She didn't realize it yet, but she was already holding the match. The next day, Thursday, arrived with a silence that felt sinister and deliberate. The kind of quiet that comes before a controlled demolition. Clara woke up feeling scraped raw, made a pot of tea for one, and opened her laptop, hoping to find solace in the one corner of her life she believed was still hers, her own freelance design career. Maybe today could be a fresh start. Maybe she could bury herself in client work and debugging. Maybe she could ping her network and start mapping out a path forward. Maybe she could feel like a designer again. Instead, today was the day they came for the rest of her professional life. She had a final round interview for a lead product designer role at a top tech firm, a career-making opportunity she had been pursuing for months. She waited in the Zoom meeting for 20 minutes. Finally, a junior HR associate she didn't recognize appeared on the screen, explaining that the head of design was unexpectedly called away but had passed along a message. The young man looked profoundly uncomfortable. The message was that her candidacy was no longer being considered. "Ma'am," he stammered, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder, "we were contacted this morning by Vanguard Ventures. They've just become a primary investor in our Series C funding round. They claim that you are misrepresenting your work on a proprietary project in your portfolio, and since their fund is now launching a similar product, it creates a significant conflict of interest for our company. We have to be meticulous about protecting IP." Clara felt the air leave her lungs. That is a lie. He knows that's a lie. I have spent 10 years building my name in this industry. Ask anyone in the design community. They know my work. The associate finally met her eyes, and they were full of pity. "Vanguard Ventures is one of the biggest players in the Valley, ma'am. They made it very clear that any continued association with you would put our funding in jeopardy. I am so sorry, but our executive team has instructed us to halt the interview process, effective immediately. Who from that firm sent the notice?" Ilara's voice was a ghost of itself. "I need the name of the person doing this." The conflict of interest claim was sent by Genevieve Dubois on behalf of their new joint enterprise. "I am so sorry. We can't be involved." Ilara stood up from her desk in a daze, her arms hanging uselessly at her sides. Her career wasn't just built on concrete and steel. It was founded on integrity and trust, and they had just methodically poisoned every last relationship. A decade of her professional life, deleted by a single vindictive email, small enough to be shattered by a single truth. In the cavernous silence of their Chicago penthouse, gasping for breath, she saw the glow of the office monitor Julian had left on. It displayed a messaging app open to a chat with Cora Sterling. He was coaching the developer on the historical precedents for the Pinnacle's design, giving her Eris's own meticulously researched talking points for the press launch. He was feeding Cora the words from Eris's own publications, passing off her intellect, her entire career's foundation, as nothing more than a script for his mistress to perform. Cora's icon, a sharp, professional headshot, was next to a message that read, "Perfect. They'll see me as the visionary behind the concept." And in that moment, Eris finally understood. The recent rejection letter from the prestigious Architectural Fellowship wasn't a failure on her part. It was a calculated move, orchestrated by someone who knew it was her one escape plan, her path to an independent career. This wasn't just infidelity. This was the systematic demolition of her future, engineered by a woman who intended to own every last piece of the world Eris had built. Her life had been reduced to a heap of glittering, razor-sharp ruins. When she walked into the living room, Julian was on a call, his silhouette framed against the vast, twinkling expanse of the city skyline. He saw her, and his expression shifted instantly, a mask of deep concern clicking into place. "She's home now," he murmured into his phone. "Yes, she just got the news. She's devastated, of course. Honestly, it's a blessing in disguise. That kind of pressure isn't healthy for the baby." It was a masterful portrayal of a husband worried for his pregnant wife. "I wasn't rejected because of stress. I was..." But her voice trailed off as he held up a hand, a gesture of absolute command that silenced her completely. The caller ID on his phone read Cora CS, and he had the call on speaker. A power move so blatant it could only be for her benefit, ensuring she heard every syllable. Cora's crisp, authoritative voice echoed in the room. "I told you, Julian, her academic obsession was always a liability. Has the PR team started seeding the new narrative? We need to position this as her choice to step away, overwhelmed by the pregnancy. It will make the transition cleaner when you assume sole directorship of the firm." Julian's gaze met Eris's, and for a split second, she thought she saw regret, but it was erased as quickly as it appeared. "Just a final lighting check at the site," Julian had called to say an hour before. "The launch is in 2 days. I have to get it perfect." Eris now stood alone in the home office they had designed together, a sleek space of glass and steel overlooking Lake Michigan that now felt like a cage. The silence hummed with the city's distant energy. Her hand hovered over the keyboard of his primary workstation, the nerve center of his creative process. A desperate urge to reconnect with the work they once shared, the passion that was now consuming him, made her sit down. It was an astounding lapse in caution for a man as methodical as Julian. Open on the screen, nestled behind his presentation software, was the messaging app. He had forgotten to close the window. Eris felt a chill creep over her as she scrolled up. This wasn't just business. The first thread was a series of reservations for a private suite at the Langham, booked for months. Then came links to extravagant jewelry and receipts for tailored suits, all routed through a shell corporation. The chats were intimate, detailed, and addressed to Cora Sterling, the lead developer, the project's financial savior. She kept scrolling, her horror mounting. It was more than an affair, it was a conspiracy laid bare. Using her own administrative password, she logged into their firm's central server and found a partition she'd never seen before. It contained a second set of contracts. It showed a methodical transfer of assets, reallocating the intellectual property rights from her foundational research, the very soul of their firm, directly to a holding company owned by Cora. They were systematically gutting her professional life to finance their own. The last exchange was from that very afternoon. Cora wrote, "The final tranche of funding will be released the moment the Pinnacle launches. Once the board confirms you as the sole creative partner, our brilliant architect will have finally paid his way." Julian's response was a single gut-wrenching line. "She'll never know. She's too busy picking out colors for the nursery." The phone almost slipped from Eris's numb fingers as she took a picture of the screen. Her first primal urge was to shatter the glass wall of the office, to destroy the view he was so proud of. But then a cold, precise clarity cut through the white-hot rage. Eris was a historian. Her entire life was built on research, on constructing a narrative from evidence, and delivering a final, unassailable conclusion. A hysterical, tear-soaked confrontation was exactly the scene they had written for her, but a professional and public vivisection? That was a thesis she could write herself. With hands that were now perfectly steady, she began to photograph and download every chat log, every hidden contract, every falsified invoice, saving them to a private, encrypted drive. The tears never fell. Instead, she started building her case. Friday dawned gray and cold, rain streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows. It was 24 hours to the launch party for the Pinnacle, and Eris hadn't slept at all. She'd spent the night in a hard, modern chair in the living room, meticulously organizing her evidence, feeling for the first time in a year like she was the architect of her own life, not just a footnote in his. Julian had come in well after 3 a.m, the scent of expensive gin and a sharp, unfamiliar gardenia perfume clinging to his coat. He hadn't even seen her sitting there in the dark. He saw only the version of her that fit his story. Her best friend, Maya, arrived at 9 a.m. with a box of pastries and the sharp gaze of an investigative journalist who had never trusted Julian. "Okay," Aris said, opening the door. "I need your professional opinion, but first, promise me you won't write a single word until I say so." Maya's notoriously cynical eyebrows shot up. "Aris, is that a strategic tone? Don't tell me. You finally caught him. You've got the proof, and you're ready to burn him to the ground." "Oh, it's far more elegant than that," Eris said, a grim, determined smile touching her lips for the first time. "I have the entire blueprint. Him and Cora Sterling. They're using my research and my stake in our firm to build their empire." She laid out everything. The secret messages, the fraudulent contracts, the cruel comment about the nursery. Maya, the seasoned reporter, placed the pastry box on the counter with the quiet intensity of someone who had just been handed the biggest story of her career. "Cora Sterling? Of Sterling Properties? Aris, this isn't just cheating. This is high-level corporate fraud involving one of the most powerful real estate dynasties in the Midwest." "I am going to tear him apart in my next column," Maya seethed. "No," Aris said, her voice like ice. "We are, but not with a story. Not yet. His entire career is built on this illusion, this image of the lone artistic genius. The Pinnacle is his legacy, and we are going to host his professional execution right there. I need the original incorporation documents for our firm, the ones my lawyer has in storage." An hour later, they sat in the sterile quiet of a law office conference room. Her lawyer, seeing the new steel in Eris's eyes, had retrieved the files without a single question. For years, Eris had accepted Julian's simplified summaries of their business agreements. Now, with Maya's journalistic suspicion guiding her, she saw the complex web of clauses she had so trustingly signed. "Eris," Maya said, her voice dropping ominously, "who is Sterling Global Acquisitions?" Eris looked up from a capital investment sheet. "That's Cora's family's parent company. They handle procurement. Julian said they were a necessary partner for sourcing rare materials. Why?" Maya tapped a finger on a thick, legalistic paragraph buried deep in the contract. "Because according to this, they aren't just a partner. This clause grants them perpetual ownership of all foundational design methodologies developed by your firm for unrestricted use in all future Sterling projects worldwide." The air in the room grew thin. A string of late-night searches on her tablet led Amelia to a small collection of archived articles from the city's Architectural Digest. The titles were a gut punch. "Emerging designer accuses Sterling Group of plagiarism. Lawsuit against development titan ends in sealed settlement." The pieces included a picture of a brilliant young architect, a former classmate of Liam's, looking defeated as he announced his departure from San Francisco after a brutal legal battle with the Sterling family. A sudden, icy realization washed over Maya. She had a crystal-clear memory of Julian scoffing at that very same development firm just a few years ago, calling them corporate vultures who crushed true artists. Everything snapped into place with sickening precision. This wasn't some recent mistake. It was a predatory system. The Serrano family would find up-and-coming architects, use their daughter, Isabella, to lure them into impossible contracts and then systematically absorb their life's work into the corporate machine. Julian hadn't landed a dream project. He had sold his entire firm, and he'd used Maya's inheritance as the down payment. The entire story was laid out in the cold, hard data of the hidden files. There was no brilliant collaboration. There was only a hostile, meticulously planned takeover. The grand opening of the Isabella, the skyscraper she believed was their shared legacy, was merely the final step in a deal to sell her husband's talent to his mistress. He wasn't just unfaithful. He was using the money she'd given him to indenture himself to another woman's dynasty. The raw, chilling arrogance of it all left her breathless. There wasn't a legal escape hatch to find, no loophole to exploit. Her power was in the narrative itself. The files on her laptop were proof of a calculated, deeply personal fraud, and the old news articles were proof of a predatory business model that could shatter the Serrano Group's polished public facade. This was no longer about a cheating husband. This was about seizing back a future that had been stolen from her. "My God, Maya," Zoe whispered, watching the look of cold fury settle onto her friend's face. They weren't investing in him. They were acquiring him. The launch gala tomorrow night was a celebration thrown by the very corporation that had engineered her ruin. It was Julian's big night. It was the perfect venue. He always wanted to be the star of the show, Maya said, her voice completely flat. "Fine, I'm going to tear the whole stage down." Back in the sterile silence of their apartment, Maya rested a hand on the firm curve of her belly. The gnawing loneliness that had haunted her pregnancy was gone, replaced by a core of pure ice. Julian was building a monument to his career on the ruins of her own, with a woman whose family specialized in devouring men like him. The baby kicked, a small, fierce reminder of the future she was now fighting for. This was no longer about a broken heart. This was about a hostile takeover of her life. Julian would be home soon, expecting his adoring, docile, pregnant wife. The performance of a lifetime was about to start. Julian was in site meetings all day before the grand opening, so she used the time to organize his project files. Buried in the metadata of a photo of the building's cornerstone labeled simply continuity, she found it. The true acquisition agreement with the Serrano Development Group. The public relations draft praised a visionary partnership, but the legal contract told a different story. The tower, the Isabella, named for the lead negotiator, was a complete buyout of his firm. Her seed money, the inheritance she'd invested, was listed as a minor capital injection, already absorbed. She clicked on Isabella Serrano's photo in the file. A beautiful, dark-haired woman clinking a champagne glass with Julian in a penthouse Maya had never seen. "That can't be possible," Maya whispered into the phone, her voice unsteady in the quiet of her friend Zoe's condo. "Can you check the original firm's incorporation documents again?" Her lawyer, Mr. Davies, sighed with professional patience on the other end. "Mrs. Alastair, the paper trail is absolute. Your initial capital contribution makes you the majority partner of the original LLC. The office lease, the rendering software, every high-end workstation, he secured it all using your financial backing. From a legal standpoint, you own the controlling interest in the foundational asset." Zoe, who was listening on speaker, let out a long, slow whistle. "The grand unveiling is tomorrow evening at the tower itself," Mr. Davies went on, his tone shifting into pure strategy. "It's for the Isabella. The very brand your capital created, Maya. Your presence would be strategically sound. You must stake your claim." "That's my stage," Maya murmured, the words feeling sharp and foreign in her mouth. "There's something else. the lawyer added, his voice turning grim. The new corporate structure filed with the Serrano Group last month is a clear-cut attempt to render your original shares meaningless. He's been systematically erasing you, betting you were too busy with the pregnancy to ever look. He built his entire reputation on the foundation you provided, and now he's trying to paint over your name. Maya pressed her fingertips to her temples. Every time he'd dismissed her photography as a cute hobby, every time he'd urged her to relax and focus on the baby instead of the firm's finances, it wasn't care. It was a strategy, a quiet, systematic effort to push her into the margins of her own life. Mr. Davies, there is one absolutely critical detail, Maya said, her voice suddenly like steel. My husband has no idea that I know any of this. Only Zoe knows. There was a beat of silence. Excellent, the lawyer responded. In that case, tomorrow evening ought to be quite the spectacle. I will have my people ready. After she hung up, Maya and Zoe were sitting on the floor of Zoe's ridiculously expensive Gold Coast condo, surrounded by a sea of legal documents. Zoe finally broke the silence. So, let's review. Your husband, who for the past year has treated his pregnant wife like a delicate flower, is about to unveil a $50 million skyscraper named after his mistress, financed with your inheritance, while simultaneously trying to legally destroy your ownership of his company. And tomorrow, he expects you to show up, smile, and clap? Maya stared out at the city skyline and gave a single hard nod. Christ, Zoe breathed, shaking her head. The audacity of that man could solve the global energy crisis. But yours, Maya? Yours could bring down the whole damn grid. For the first time in what felt like a year, Maya felt a flicker of her old self. It wasn't joy, just a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. The feeling was short-lived. At 4 p.m, Maya went to log into her personal brokerage account. She needed capital. She needed a war chest. For Mr. Davies's retainer. For a secure new place to live. For a way to survive when Julian would inevitably lock her out of their joint bank accounts. She typed in her password. Her brokerage account balance, securities, $0. Cash reserves, $0. Maya's breath hitched in her chest. She refreshed the browser, and again, everything was gone. Every last dollar, the money from her last photography exhibit, the safety net she had so carefully guarded, had vanished. She called her wealth manager. A calm, clinical voice informed her that her entire portfolio had been liquidated early that morning. The assets had been transferred to a new corporate entity. The only signature on the transfer authorization was Julian Alistair's as the primary account holder. Maya ended the call and immediately dialed Julian. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice clipped and annoyed. I'm in a pre-gala briefing. Can this wait? The money, she said, her voice flat. Where is it? Oh, that, he answered, his tone so casual it was chilling. I had to move it around. A last-minute capital injection to cover some unexpected costs before the launch. Think of it as an investment in our future. In the baby's future. You should be thrilled. I can't even buy a train ticket, Julian. I have nothing. Well then, he said, his voice dropping into a venomous, quiet hiss, you had better be on your very best behavior tomorrow night and not do anything to screw this up for our family. He disconnected. Maya stood in the afternoon light of her bedroom, the phone in her hand feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Yesterday, she was the secret power behind an architectural visionary. An hour ago, she had felt a jolt of righteous power. Now, she couldn't even afford a cab. She called Zoe and managed to choke out what he had done. Zoe's response was a beautiful, vicious storm of insults directed at Julian, followed by a command. Get in an Uber. It's on me. I am opening a bottle of champagne that costs more than my rent, and we are going to weaponize this rage. Do not even think about arguing with me. That night, sitting at the enormous marble island in Zoe's kitchen, Maya felt the walls closing in. I have nothing, Zoe. No money, no leverage. He has probably already had his IT guy lock me out of the company's servers. The paperwork says I own it, but in the real world, right now, I have absolutely no power. Zoe walked around the island and took both of Maya's hands in hers. Stop that. Look at me. You have the one asset he was too arrogant to ever see as a threat. You have the truth. And tomorrow night, you are going to walk into his party, onto his stage, and you are going to let it do its job. What if that's not enough? Zoe squeezed her hands. It is always enough. It just never feels that way before the battle begins. On Friday night, the main atrium of the Isabella was a cathedral of glass and raw ambition. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a glittering panorama of the Chicago skyline, casting a dramatic light on the black cars delivering the city's powerful elite to the curb. Inside, the worlds of high-stakes real estate and high design had merged, buzzing with the sound of quiet negotiations and the shared assumption that they were witnessing the coronation of the city's next great architect. Towering arrangements of white orchids stood like sentinels between islands of flawlessly dressed patrons. A string trio played softly from a suspended balcony, while servers in sharp, dark uniforms moved like shadows, balancing trays of champagne and elaborate canapés. 300 of the city's most influential figures, investors, critics, and society mavens, were all settled into their roles, utterly ignorant that the true majority owner of the evening's main attraction, she was about to step into the lion's den wearing a dress he had once called understated. Claire had worked a small wonder. She'd pulled a simple emerald green velvet maternity gown from Eleanor's closet and paired it with a pair of severe Art Deco diamond earrings from her own collection. The gown was no longer simple. It was a canvas. It didn't whisper wealth. It projected a cool, sharp confidence that highlighted Eleanor's own formidable intellect. Of course, nobody in this room cared about quiet confidence. They were here for the spectacle. "You look like an avenging angel," Claire said, fastening the antique clasp on her wrist. "So, what's the strategy?" Mr. Sterling confronts him near the main ballroom entrance at exactly 9:30. "Until then, you are the radiant, devoted wife. You don't look at Serafina. You don't even acknowledge her chief of staff. You just watch." Eleanor nodded, then pulled Claire into a fierce, sudden hug. "If this goes sideways," she whispered, "you are the best sister anyone could ever ask for." "Nothing is going sideways," Claire said, her voice like steel. "Now go. And I want a full report on every single bead of sweat on that woman's upper lip when she figures it out. When Serafina realizes the real estate portfolio she helped him steal is now under the control of a new conservator, I'm expecting a very controlled, very elegant meltdown." Eleanor stepped into the main hall of the Chicago Art Institute, a wing her firm had designed and funded, and it felt like walking through the ghost of her own life. She saw Marcus immediately. He was the center of the universe, and every other developer and city official in the room was a planet caught in his gravitational pull. He was holding a glass of bourbon as if it were an award for architecture. He was maddeningly handsome, projecting that innovative, effortless charisma that made old Chicago money eager to fund his skyscrapers. His custom suit was cut to perfection, almost certainly paid for with capital diverted from their joint accounts, and his smile was a bright, calculated tool aimed at a journalist from a major design magazine. And there, attached to his arm in a stark white gown that looked like it was carved from marble, was Serafina. Her hand rested on his forearm with a clear statement of ownership. She was sleek and angular, scanning the gala like a developer appraising her newly acquired skyline. Marcus's mother, Genevieve, stood nearby, sipping champagne and radiating an air of complete victory. Eleanor kept to the periphery of the room. She moved with the quiet grace she'd learned over the last few years, a habit of making herself smaller so he could seem bigger. But tonight, her near invisibility was her strategy. She observed, she listened. She put the faces of the investors and zoning board members to the names Mr. Sterling had briefed her on. She was studying a scale model of the skyscraper they had designed together when Marcus materialized at her side. His voice was a shard of ice in her ear, perfectly concealed from the couple admiring the model just a few feet away. "What in God's name are you doing here, Ellie?" "What is this, Eleanor?" Marcus's voice was a low threat. "You're supposed to be at home, resting." Eleanor turned to meet his gaze, her posture unyielding. "It's a gala celebrating the firm we built, Marcus. Of course I'm here." His eyes swept over her bespoke maternity gown with open disgust. "Dressed like that? In front of our biggest clients?" Serafina appeared at his elbow, her timing impeccable. "Darling, there you are. Marcus, I thought we agreed this sort of event was too much stress for her condition." And then a powerful city alderman Marcus had been courting for months drifted over, completing the pincer movement, a drink in his hand and a politician's curiosity in his eyes. "Let her enjoy herself, Marcus. It's nice." Almost. It felt like starring in a silent film while everyone else was at a full-blown opera. Eleanor felt the old, conditioned knot of panic in her stomach, a physical reaction her body had learned from years of Marcus's subtle psychological warfare. But under the fear, a new certainty was hardening into crystal. It was a strength born from discovering an old password, forged during sleepless nights on her sister's guest bed and weaponized by a lawyer who believed every word. She looked at Marcus, her husband of 5 years, and spoke the 7 words that would set his perfectly designed world on fire. "I found the contingency folder. Marcus. I saw the one where you and Serafina drafted the legal petition to have me declared unfit due to hormonal instability. I saw the plan to dissolve our partnership, and I know you transferred the deeds to our properties into a blind trust this morning." The sophisticated murmur of Chicago's real estate and finance elite vanished, replaced by a vacuum of pure, uncut scandal. It was better than gossip. It was a live demolition. The kind of quiet that falls when the sharks smell blood, a collective, rapturous understanding that this meltdown would be the story of the year. Marcus's face went through 3 rapid changes. First came the sheer terror of an architect watching his prize-winning building get condemned in real time. Second was the frantic calculation of a developer watching the market completely collapse. He settled on the third, his most practiced strategy, condescending worry. "Ellie, my love, you're unwell," he said, his voice just loud enough for the surrounding guests to hear. "The pregnancy has been making you paranoid. She's been having these terrible fantasies, poor thing." Serafina, his sharp and ambitious partner, slid into her supporting role without a single missed beat. "It's why she had to step away from the firm. The pressure was just too great. We've all been so terribly concerned about her." She clearly wasn't processing things correctly. And Serafina, playing the part of the concerned, hyper-capable friend, delivered the final professional cut. "As the person responsible for this firm's public image, Eleanor, I have to advise you to stop. This kind of display. It's creating a very unstable narrative for you." Eleanor felt the air in the brightly lit modern gallery turn frigid. This was it. The moment her digital, undeniable proof would shatter their carefully constructed lies. She had the cloud account. She had the scanned documents. Her hand was steady as she reached into her clutch to pull out her tablet. The login failed, access denied. The screen was blank, the cloud folder gone. The damning documents of Marcus and Serafina's plot, the signed property transfers, the entire scheme to erase her, all of it vanished. He leaned close, his breath a foul mix of bourbon and victory, his whisper a precise surgical blow meant only for her. "Our new IT director is a genius, isn't he? He saw an unrecognized login from your tablet an hour ago, He wiped the entire account and deleted the local sync file before our car even pulled up. The assets are already in a trust in Nevis. He pulled back, his expression snapping into a mask of pained compassion for his audience. "Darling," he murmured, his voice thick with fake sympathy, "let's get you home. You need to sleep. For our son." The whispers caught fire instantly. "Poor dear, she's completely cracked. I heard she had a breakdown during the planning commission meeting." Marcus is a living saint for handling this with such class. Serafina was already in a serious, low-toned conversation with the design journalist, her professional demeanor making fiction sound like fact. "There's a history of mental illness in her family. Her father was a brilliant architect, but notoriously unstable. It's an absolute tragedy. We've been trying to get her into a private residential facility for months." Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the sprawling gallery she had helped design, suddenly a pariah among the very people who once vied for her attention. She was holding a dark tablet, wearing a couture gown that now felt like a joke, and the invisible structure they had been building around her for a year had just become a steel cage. Then Marcus grabbed her arm, his fingers pressing into a nerve he knew would make her flinch. A small, vicious assertion of his control. "I told you not to ruin my night," he spat, the charming mask gone now that he was sure he'd won. "My sincerest apologies for this display," he announced to the room, beginning to steer her toward the massive glass entryway. "My wife is simply not herself. This pregnancy has been incredibly difficult, and we're looking into getting her more intensive care." "Let go of me," Eleanor said, her voice a low tremor as she tried to wrench her arm away. "Don't you dare put your hands on me." "You see?" he pleaded with the crowd, his face a flawless portrait of a husband at his wit's end. "This is what I live with, this volatility. I honestly don't know what else I can do." Serafina was right there, her expression one of clinical pity. Her father had similar public outbursts. "It's a heartbreaking genetic legacy. We always feared it would come to this." From across their rapt audience, with the calm authority of a senior partner, Serafina delivered the final, reputation-shattering diagnosis. "It's a classic example of psychological projection, I'm afraid. A profound anxiety about her own changing role is causing her to create these complex delusions of persecution. It's truly tragic to watch." Eleanor desperately searched the room. 100 pairs of eyes stared back, a mixture of morbid fascination, smug pity, and the cold relief of seeing a competitor spectacularly implode. Not a single person offered her a shred of belief. The sobs started then, not the quiet, dignified tears she had cried in private, but a raw, desperate sound that tore from her chest and shook her entire frame. "He's lying! Can't any of you see he's lying?" she yelled, her voice shattering. "Doesn't anybody believe me?" In that moment, Marcus's performance as the long-suffering husband was complete. All that was left was a chilling, hollow contempt. "You were just the initial investment, Chloe," he sneered, his words laced with poison. "A pretty face with an art world pedigree. That was your only real value." Then he pushed her. With his palms flat on her shoulders, he shoved with a startling viciousness. The force sent her stumbling, her balance already precarious with the weight of their child. Her designer heel snagged on the edge of a recessed floor light. Her arms pinwheeled through the air, finding no purchase as the gallery spotlight swam dizzily above, and the cold, unforgiving marble floor rushed up to claim her. The violent shove sent a sharp, electrifying pain through her lower back. Her beaded clutch flew from her grasp, its contents scattering across the polished concrete. A tube of designer lipstick, a valet stub, her phone, and a small, tarnished silver locket on a simple chain, her mother's locket. It skated across the smooth surface, its antique gleam catching the light from a nearby installation before it chimed softly to a halt against the toe of an immaculate, handmade leather loafer. 300 people watched her collapse. Not one of them made a move to help. Julian Croft had been a pillar of the Chicago art world for over 40 years. He had transformed a small shipping business into a global logistics empire, but his true passion was patronage. After his closest friend, the brilliant abstract painter Evelyn Reed, died from a sudden illness, Julian had spent years searching for the daughter she had given up for adoption. He was met with sealed records and bureaucratic silence. For 2 decades, Julian had championed his friend's legacy, quietly overseeing the prestigious arts grant he had founded in her name. When the small silver locket came to rest beside his shoe, he knew. He didn't need to look up at the pregnant woman struggling on the floor. He recognized the intricate engraving instantly. He had commissioned the piece for Evelyn himself. He could still hear her voice, ringing with the passion that fueled her art. Every artist is searching for their own true north, Julian. I had this made for my daughter. It's for the life she'll build one day. If she ever finds her way into this world, this will let her know who she is. It's her birthright. Ethan found his pregnant wife on the floor of the stark white gallery. Dark mascara tracks marred her pale cheeks, but beneath the stunned expression, he saw her. He saw Chloe's razor-sharp intellect and the stubborn set of her jaw, a look he knew all too well. Ethan picked up a discarded launch brochure, his thumb brushing over a sleek photo of the app's interface, a design so achingly familiar it felt like a dagger in his ribs. "Hey," he said, his voice a quiet murmur as he helped her rise. "You all right?" She could only offer a tiny fractured shake of her head, the heavy stone of betrayal lodged in her throat silencing any words. He completely ignored the smug-faced venture capitalist who had shoved her aside. He paid no mind to the whispers snaking through the assembled tech world elite. He simply caught the eye of his head of security posted by the door and gave a small, sharp nod. The sedan, at the service exit, now. Causing a scene was a rookie move. He understood that the quiet, brutal efficiency of his legal team would be a far more devastating response. Ethan turned back to the woman, his voice a steadying presence in the suddenly tense room. "Come on, I'm getting you out of here. You're with me now." He helped Chloe to her feet with the same gentle precision he would use to handle a priceless sculpture. He steered her through the staring crowd, which parted for them like a curtain, leading her past glowing screens that celebrated the technological genius of the man who had just destroyed her reality. In the silent, leather-scented interior of his Maybach as it slipped into the Chicago night, he handed her a bottle of water and a cashmere wrap. He sat across from her and gently placed the silver locket into her palm. "My name is Julian Croft," he said softly. "Your mother was the most gifted painter I have ever known, and I am the steward of her legacy." The total sum transferred was just shy of $900,000, all of it routed to a freshly minted shell company. Chloe stared at the transaction records on the laptop, then at her friend Maya, then down at her own hands, which cradled the swell of her 8-month pregnancy. "He told me Innovate Capital was a small seed fund for a colleague," she murmured, her voice feeling alien in the vast, silent loft. All this time it was for her asterisk. Maya pointed to a highlighted line on the screen. "And he used a forged power of attorney on your father's estate to access the funds. The only real question, Chloe, is what are you going to do about it?" The distant wail of an ambulance felt like it was from another universe, a different reality than the one that had just been shattered within the walls of her own home. She was the daughter of a man who taught her that in a negotiation, you never cede an inch of ground. But what Chloe said next made even Maya pause. "I don't want to get even. I want to utterly dismantle them. There is a world of difference." Chloe's first call was to her Uncle Leo, a corporate lawyer whose fearsome reputation was forged in the fires of hostile takeovers. The phone barely completed a single ring before he answered, the faint clink of ice in a heavy tumbler audible in the background. Sweetheart, I am 20 minutes away from deposing a CEO in a billion-dollar merger. This had better be a 5-alarm emergency. Leo, Chloe said, her voice becoming as cold and clear as ice, I need you at my loft, immediately. Take the freight elevator and bring the encrypted laptop. Why do I have the distinct feeling I am about to aid and abet in something truly spectacular? Because you are, Chloe replied. And Leo, bring that single malt you saved for victory. While she waited, Chloe laid out 3 objectives for Maya, each one as clean and decisive as a scalpel. First, Sophia's venture firm is celebrating the acquisition of Ethan's company tonight at the Innovators Ball. She's going to paint me as the crazy, emotional wife. I need that narrative dead on arrival. Maya's expression sharpened into one of cold, professional fury. Are you kidding? With the original algorithm drafts watermarked with your father's name from 6 years ago, plus the proof he used your inheritance as illegal seed capital, we can get an emergency injunction for fraud and intellectual property theft that will freeze the entire deal. Second, Ethan used your money to fund it. Can we trace it back to you exclusively? Maya nodded sharply. The digital trail from the estate account is crystal clear. He moved that money without your consent. That's not just a breach of trust, Chloe. That's felony wire fraud. Third, Chloe continued, the tech incubator he works for. If Sophia promised him a partnership in her venture firm in exchange for the algorithm, does that put him in a difficult position? Maya let out a short, harsh laugh. It's a career-ending position. It's a flagrant violation of his employment contract and his non-disclosure agreement. It's more than enough to have him permanently blacklisted in the industry. Chloe met Maya's gaze, her own eyes unwavering. Excellent. That's the plan then. She didn't fire off a single angry text. She didn't call his family to complain. She knew that real power was always exercised in silence. She had Leo intercept 3 key people who were mingling at the lavish party. The first was the managing partner of Ethan's incubator, a tech legend named David Chen, who was holding court near the champagne bar. Leo approached him with the calm demeanor of a man who knows he's already won and showed him a tablet displaying undeniable proof that his rising star was a fraud who had stolen proprietary code and embezzled from his wife to fund a competitor. David's face morphed from convivial curiosity to an icy, controlled fury that promised a swift and brutal reckoning. The second person was Marcus Vance, the lead investor in Sophia's venture fund. Leo informed him with that same quiet certainty that the fund's newest acquisition was built on stolen intellectual property and that a federal investigation was about to freeze every asset connected to the deal. Marcus's glass of bourbon paused halfway to his mouth, hovering there for a full 5 seconds. The third was a famously aggressive tech journalist from Wired, a woman who had sunk multi-billion-dollar startups. Leo simply gave her a plain business card with a QR code, which led to a secure server containing the original code, the fraudulent bank transfers, and the damning evidence of collusion. While these surgically precise attacks were unfolding on the periphery of the gala, Ethan and Sophia were radiating success at the center of the grand ballroom. They were blissfully ignorant that the entire edifice of their triumph was being systematically dismantled around them. They were far too engaged in accepting praise, soaking in the admiration for what they believed was their masterstroke. Then the first domino fell. Marcus Vance made a beeline for Ethan, his expression a mask of stone. Ethan, he began, his voice a low rumble, I've just had a very informative conversation. Tell me, when exactly were you planning to disclose that your marriage came with a $900,000 conflict of interest? Ethan scoffed, a dismissive, arrogant sound. My wife? Don't waste a second worrying about Chloe. She's an art history major. She's probably home right now debating shades of beige for the nursery. Mark watched him with a heavy, searching gaze. All right, I need to speak with my client. He moved off through the crowd, leaving Ethan with a prickle of dread. Across the polished marble floor, Scarlett Vance clinked her glass against Chloe's. "Mrs. Hayes, are you aware that the groundbreaking engineering for your new tower is about to become the centerpiece of a massive intellectual property lawsuit, and that your star architect husband is about to be professionally ruined?" Chloe's champagne flute felt suddenly slick in her hand. At that exact moment, tucked away near the terrace, Ethan's phone buzzed. He answered, and the blood drained from his face as his firm's general counsel delivered a terse message that ended with the words, "Your corporate accounts and building access have been frozen, effective immediately." The net tightened around them both, from two different directions for two separate betrayals, and neither one could process what was happening. Their eyes met across the glittering ballroom, their triumphant smiles collapsing into a shared, escalating panic. Just then, the grand oak doors to the main hall swung open, and a man they had prayed would never be there appeared. Marcus Thorne was in his late 60s, wore an impeccably tailored suit that whispered of old money and power, and had the cold, placid eyes of a man who had built a legal dynasty by burying his opponents. Chloe's voice was ice, the proprietary design clause in his employment contract. Who has final authority to enforce it? "The lead investor," Mark replied, his attention now total. "Mr. Peterson, is he still in the main ballroom?" A paralegal, fiercely loyal to Chloe, glanced at her tablet. "Yes, he is." "Perfect. Let's go have a word." Chloe started walking, not towards the quiet lounge, but straight for the center of the gala. The same path she was meant to walk as Ethan's proud, supportive wife. But she was done being his shadow. She was done letting him take credit for her brilliance. She was Chloe Thorne Hayes, and she was about to turn a celebration into a corporate execution. She aimed directly for Mr. Peterson, who was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, sipping an old-fashioned. He had the look of a man who had already dodged 3 hostile takeovers that year and was bored by the prospect of a 4th. "Mr. Peterson," Chloe began, her voice ringing with the clarity of someone who had already lost everything that mattered. "My name is Chloe Hayes. In about 3 minutes, a fraudulent copyright claim on my husband's Apex Tower design, facilitated by the lead developer Scarlett Vance, will be used to steal this entire project from both of us." Peterson looked her over, his expression unreadable. "And why would I believe you?" "Because my brother, Mark Thorne, one of the top IP attorneys in the state, is here to explain how to protect your $50 million investment. Because my lead drafter can verify my husband stole my original schematics, and because if you look at the man over there who used our shared home equity to finance his affair, you will find the moral turpitude clause you need to void his contract and stop Scarlett Vance from making your entire portfolio a laughingstock. You'll see him laughing with the woman who spent the last 6 months trying to sabotage my career." The investor scanned the room. Ethan was smiling, but it was a brittle, fragile thing. Scarlett Vance, a developer with a reputation for sharp elbows, stayed close to his side, her gaze darting towards the exits. A nervous junior partner was on his 3rd glass of champagne, his hand shaking. "Show me," Mr. Peterson said. They moved to a private study. Mark laid out the files on a mahogany desk. An assistant mirrored a tablet to a large screen, displaying Ethan's submitted blueprints next to Chloe's own time-stamped encrypted design files. 3 windows were open on the monitor, flirtatious text messages, hotel bills charged to their joint account, and the stolen structural engineering plans submitted for the Apex Tower project. Chloe stared at the evidence her brother had compiled. Files that a confidential source within Ethan's own office had pulled from a private server. She analyzed it all with the cold detachment of an engineer who had spent her life identifying critical points of failure. When she looked up, she saw her reflection in the blank screen, her face a mask of terrible certainty and a resolve that felt like case-hardened steel. Professor Adler, she thought, recalling her favorite mentor's advice. In my 30 years of teaching, I've learned a few things about architecture. The people who steal your blueprints, he'd once told her, are always the ones too afraid to pour their own foundation. She didn't need to scream or cry tonight. She just had to present the facts and claim her work. That kind of truth was stronger than any skyscraper. She stood up from the leather chair. "Let's go crash that press conference." Chloe walked into the blinding lights of the press suite and cleared her throat. The room went quiet, the low hum of cameras and reporters dying out as dozens of journalists turned to stare, their questions dying on their lips. Every camera in the room swiveled to the woman who had suddenly become its center of gravity. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice as steady as a bedrock foundation. "My apologies for the interruption. I have some urgent corrections to the presentation you're about to receive. First, the revolutionary seismic-resistant core design for the Apex Tower was created by me, Chloe Hayes, not, as was falsely claimed, by my husband, Ethan Hayes." Ethan leaped to his feet from the presenter's table, knocking over a glass of water that shattered on the floor. "This is outrageous!" He sputtered, but the senior journalist from the Tribune ignored him. "Second," Chloe continued, her eyes landing on a familiar redhead near the back, "the campaign of professional slander and stolen pitches that has targeted my engineering firm for the last year has been orchestrated by Miss Scarlett Vance. She is barred from this project, and a formal complaint for tortious interference has been filed with the state licensing board." Scarlett was already backing towards the door, her face a mask of shock. Two uniformed security guards, summoned by a quiet signal from Peterson, blocked her escape. They were paid to be unmovable. Third, Chloe's voice grew stronger, filling the silent room. "A legal petition filed by Mr. Ethan Hayes to seize control of my family's patent trust, citing my emotional instability due to my pregnancy, has been dismissed with prejudice. The petition was based on forged doctor's notes, and its dismissal invalidates his entire claim." In the front row, Mr. Peterson, the project's primary financial backer, calmly closed his notebook, stood up, and walked out of the room without looking back. He was a man who knew a toxic asset when he saw one, and with that, Julian's entire career was about to implode. "And for the grand finale," the gallery director announced, his voice cutting through the sophisticated murmur of the Chicago art elite. "You all know the centerpiece of this entire exhibition was the unveiling of the enigmatic new painter known only as Aria. Tonight, it is my distinct privilege to introduce the real artist, a visionary of unparalleled passion whose soul is on every canvas you see. Please welcome Mrs. Chloe Vance." Chloe emerged from the shadows by the catering entrance, a place she was never supposed to be. She wore a plain linen maternity dress she'd put on that morning, a stark contrast to the room's couture. A wave of nausea churned in her stomach, a migraine pulsed behind her temples, and her fingers were wrapped tightly around a single paint-stained brush, the one her grandfather had given her, the key to her entire craft. She wasn't surrounded by a legal team or agents. She wasn't wearing a stitch of makeup. She didn't stride in. She just moved through the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. Because Chloe Hayes had never needed theatrics to be brilliant. She only ever needed the truth. A wave of murmurs and camera flashes swept the room as dozens of people furiously reevaluated everything they thought they knew. The quiet, pregnant wife, Ethan, had patronizingly called his inspiration. The brilliant engineer Peterson had never met. The raw talent Scarlett had tried to bury. She was the genius they had all been waiting for. She was the name that would reshape the city's skyline, and her original, elegant schematics were now appearing on the massive screen behind the stage. Ethan's face was a canvas of pure disbelief. His mind, so skilled at charming clients and wooing investors, had simply crashed. All the color washed out of his face, leaving his skin a sallow, sickly gray, as if he were looking at an apparition. "That's impossible. She can't," he whispered. "She's a theorist. She just does the math." "She is the vision," Mark Thorne, her brother, said, stepping to her side with the calm authority of a man who had been waiting for this moment for months. "The engineering patent, with a valuation of over $50 million, is hers. The family trust that provided the seed money for your entire career, is hers. This entire menu, its concept, its culinary signature, it all belongs to Chef Ilara Vance, and it has from the very beginning." The lead food critic's tablet slipped from his assistant's grasp and cracked on the polished concrete floor, the sound echoing with the sharp finality of a dropped cleaver. Ilara looked at Liam, the man who had dismissed her family recipes as unmarketable, the man who had stolen her heritage, diluted her confidence, and tried to auction her soul for a Michelin star. She looked at him with an emotion that had burned past rage. It wasn't the heat of victory. It was the focus of a master chef assessing a spoiled ingredient for exactly what it is. "You tried to steal the recipes my grandmother carried across an ocean, Liam," she said, her voice low but carrying through the now silent ballroom. "And the most pathetic part isn't your greed. The most pathetic part is that you believed my heart, my entire history, was just another commodity for you to plate." She turned to Simone, who was paralyzed by the stage, clutching her clutch purse like a life raft in a sinking ship. "You called my food quaint, too personal, a chef's little side project, but I have always been this chef. Simone, the only thing that changed tonight is that you heard whispers of an award. The fact that a star rating is what it takes for you to recognize genius tells me everything I need to know about your own palate." Simone's mouth opened, but no words came out. For the first time, the critic whose review could make or break a restaurant was rendered completely irrelevant. Ilara looked at Liam last, the man who had systematically pushed her into the background, who had shared a table with her rival, who had attempted to edit her out of her own life story. "You wanted to build a brand for yourself. You craved the industry spotlight you thought I could ignite," Ilara stated. "You watched as she tried to dismiss me because you believed she was the future of the Chicago food scene, but she doesn't create anything original. She only consumes, and now your reputation is ashes." From a table near the front, a voice called out with raw, unrestrained satisfaction from a peer who had seen it all. "She's right, Ilara," another chef shouted, rising from her chair. "The sheer arrogance of these two parasites could salt every sidewalk in the city." A few tense chuckles rippled through the gathered investors and food bloggers, not from humor, but because the unbearable tension in the room demanded a release, and Ilara's chilling composure was a fortress. Event staff began quietly ushering Liam and Simone toward the exit. Liam attempted a charismatic recovery, spinning a fiction about a passionate joint venture, name-dropping culinary techniques he'd appropriated and inspirations that were never his. Simone offered brittle, practiced smiles that convinced no one. She walked with her head held high, her status as the city's premier tastemaker now shattered, knowing every single compromise she had made. And over the past year had culminated in this precise moment of private failure and public humiliation. A low murmur rose in the ballroom after they were gone. 24 of Chicago's most influential restaurateurs stood in their tailored suits, holding untouched glasses of champagne, and felt a deep, churning sensation in their stomachs that was dangerously close to complicity, because every one of them had noted the lingering glances and swallowed the hype about their culinary power couple, and not one had given a second thought to the woman, 7 months pregnant, who was the actual artist behind the feast. Ilara let them stew in it. She offered them no absolution. She didn't raise a glass to new beginnings or the future of dining. She simply stood by the podium, in her simple black dress, and told her publicist the only thing that mattered. My official restaurant announcement goes live tomorrow at 7. All profits from the first fiscal year will be placed in a trust for my son and used to fund a scholarship for immigrant women in the culinary arts, in memory of my grandmother, who taught me that true flavor is something you cultivate, not something you steal. The silence that followed was heavy. It was a blend of shock, dawning awareness, and the profound, quiet awe people feel. When they witness an act of integrity they know will become a legend. 6 months later, Ilara stood in a sunlit Chicago kitchen, placing a gentle hand on the bassinet where her son slept. The morning haze over Lake Michigan had burned off an hour ago, and the light poured through the large windows, illuminating flower dust dancing in the air. Her new concept, a tasting menu based on seasonal Midwestern ingredients, was outlined on a whiteboard. The simple wooden spoon she inherited from her grandmother felt smooth and familiar in her hand, catching the light as she began to measure spices, connecting her to a past that defined her and a future she was building by herself. She opened a new document titling it Project Saffron. She remembered her mentor's advice: cook the food that only you can cook. She began to meticulously compile her case. Every dated entry in her recipe journals, every text exchange with Liam about their future restaurant, every saved copyright registration for her menu concepts. She placed a hand on her belly, a silent promise from a mother to her child. They saw her as a resource. They saw her as a footnote. They were about to learn that a true legacy isn't what you claim, it's what you have the courage to defend. And she was fighting for more than recipes now. She was fighting for her son. With a slight tremble in her fingers, she unzipped his briefcase, looking for the insurance papers. Tucked inside a leather-bound folder was a document that made her blood turn to ice. It was a stunningly designed prospectus for a new restaurant. And there it was, a dish-by-dish breakdown of a tasting menu that was a twisted, commercialized version of her most private culinary ideas. The headline read, "A new legend for Chicago's dining scene. Chef Liam Gallo and critic Simone Dubois announce a groundbreaking partnership, Simone Dubois." The sharp, influential critic from Liam's social circle, the woman he'd once described as his intellectual equal. The wave of sickness that washed over her had nothing to do with morning sickness. That evening, she didn't light the stove. She sat waiting for him in the darkened living room, the city lights of Chicago like 1,000 glittering shards behind her. She let him talk, let him invent a story about a demanding supplier and a last-minute menu crisis at his restaurant. When his excuses finally dwindled, she simply pushed the printed restaurant prospectus across the coffee table. "I saw this," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "A groundbreaking new vision. You were right about that." He scrambled into a desperate, flimsy defense. It was a misunderstanding, he insisted. A speculative pitch to gauge investor interest. When he saw the cold, unshakable certainty in her eyes, he changed tactics. He went on the offensive. He accused her of being jealous, insecure, blaming her hormonal overreactions for her outrageous claims. "Honestly, Ilara, you are becoming completely irrational," he said, his voice dripping with fake pity. But the lie couldn't mask the pure terror in his eyes. Their entire marriage had been the lie. There was no screaming, no breaking plates, just a silence that was more brutal than any argument. The jealousy had burned through her all afternoon, leaving behind only clear, cold resolve. Ilara stood up, her 7-month pregnancy a powerful silhouette against the Chicago skyline. She held up her phone, displaying the prospectus, the menu of her stolen recipes credited to him and Simone. "I want your knives packed," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I want you out of my kitchen and out of this home before I wake up tomorrow." Liam, the celebrated chef who could command a kitchen with a single word, just stared, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. After the heavy front door finally locked, the spacious loft felt cavernous and hostile, the silence so profound her own heartbeat was a deafening drum. The image of Liam and Simone, celebrated as the city's new power couple in that prospectus, was a brand on her mind. The jealousy was a physical ache. She was pregnant, and he had thrown her away for a woman who could advance his career in a world he had locked her out of. Then a sudden sharp kick from inside her belly shattered the trance. It was a fierce, undeniable declaration. In that instant, the consuming envy for his new life dissolved, replaced by a wave of raw, primal protectiveness. Her life was no longer about being his creative partner. It was about being the foundation for the little life that was hers alone. 5 months later, a baby boy named Leo, with Ilara's dark eyes and a shock of his father's hair, slept soundly in his bassinet. The city lights across the river were now just a soft, ambient glow for a world that had shrunk to the size of this one room. When a news alert on her phone announced that Liam and Simone's restaurant venture had been permanently shelved amid a firestorm of legal challenges, she felt a quiet sense of finality. The acute pain of jealousy was a distant echo, a chapter from someone else's story. Her life had been reduced to its most essential and beautiful element, just the two of them, building a new world one day at a time. This story is a fictional creation, developed by our team to explore the harrowing journey from blinding jealousy to a state of profound independence. Each element of the plot was designed to build a narrative that not only captivates but also mirrors the painful, strengthening process of a human heart finding its own way to peace.